The Honourable Alison Xamon.
Thank you, Mr President, and congratulations on your election as President to the Legislative Council. I wish to acknowledge that we are meeting on Noongar land, that it has always been and always will be Noongar land. I also wish to convey my respects to the traditional elders of this land. These are elders who, all too frequently, are not afforded the respect they deserve, but today I honour them. I stand here this evening, humbled and honoured to be the first Greens member ever elected to represent the East Metropolitan region in this state parliament. Whilst the Greens over our history have at one time or another had representation in the other 5 regions, it's the East Metropolitan region which, until last year's state election, had remained out of our reach. Obviously I'm pleased and somewhat relieved that this is no longer the case. I also know that this is shared by a great many others, some of whom are in the gallery tonight. The East Metro region, I know, has been needing a Greens voice to represent it, to give voice to the unique social and environmental challenges which confront it, but to also provide a different set of solutions to dealing with the challenges which confront this region. Personally, I feel an affinity with East Metro and a sense of place like nowhere else. I was born in Mundaring in the hills, where my father was the minister for the Mundaring Methodist Parish. Being the child of a minister, my family moved frequently, and subsequently I grew up mainly in the flatlands of East Metro, where my father preached in the parishes of Belmont, Gosnells and Forestfield. For some kids, their happiest memories are of weekends spent at the beach, but for me, my most precious memories are of the hills. The weekends in John Forrest National Park, swimming in the Bickley Dam and pulling the leeches off afterwards, driving through the hills of Armidale or Roleystone, or swimming in the absolutely freezing cold of Lake Lishanaltia. My parents loved the hills, and it didn't take much for me to love the hills the same way. Of course, this was all some time ago, when the Perth Hills were still allowed to be bush, before multiple developments were able to grab hold and turn our hills into something different, something unsustainable. But this is something I'll speak more of later. I didn't grow up with money. In those days, ministers and their families relied heavily on the goodwill of their parishioners, and we lived in areas where the parishioners didn't have a lot more than we did anyway. I understand it's different now for those who work in the church, but in those days it was unusual for me to have new clothes, or new toys, or new anything. I never knew expensive holidays, we never really had much. It meant that from a very early age I developed a first-hand understanding of what it felt like to go without. But looking back, I know I was actually one of the lucky ones. We always had food, and in my early life at least, a stable home life. Even then, as a child, I was aware that for some of the kids in my street, our house, which was the manse, was the safe house. And I have a vivid memory of one of the kids from our street cowering in our house, too terrified to go home to theirs. So even at a young age, I was aware that for many of the families, and even my little street, in my suburb, life was a struggle, and violence and alcoholism are part of that life. Some of these suburbs are becoming gentrified now. They certainly weren't then. But I'm disappointed to say that even so many decades later, some of the suburbs I roamed as a child are as economically repressed as they were back then. It seems then that significant parts of East Metro have been left behind, despite being part of a state and part of the capital city that has experienced so much prosperity over the years. When you've grown up with not much, you don't forget how that felt. And I know that for me, it's culminated in a determination to both never feel that way again myself, but also to help others by ensuring the core roots and the debilitating effects of poverty are addressed. I'm not proud that in many respects, East Metro can claim to contain the bulk of the poverty belt of Perth, and I'm always mindful that simply living in the metropolitan area does not of itself guarantee fair access to essential services for everyone. Yet despite my family's lack of wealth growing up, I had one unique and special advantage over many others. That is, I had educated parents who instilled in me the enormous value of an education. My mum was a high school teacher at the time, and even now is finishing her doctorate in psychology. My dad was the first person in his family to ever even go to university. It's well documented that access to a quality education is one of the primary solutions to addressing the cycle of poverty. We simply have to do more to improve the status and the funding to our public education system. It's unacceptable that in 2009 we still have high schools in the East Metropolitan region who don't cater beyond Year 10. It's unacceptable that this occurs in our regional areas, but it's also happening here in Perth. What sort of message does this send to the young people in these areas? It's simply not good enough. Our teachers are exhausted and demoralised. After years working for the Teachers' Union, I witnessed this firsthand. Parents are making the expensive decision to send their children to private schools, not necessarily, as some would simplistically suggest, to reinforce existing class privilege, but often because they feel that they've been left with no choice, with our public schools allowed to deteriorate to unacceptable levels, starved of essential funds for programs and basic maintenance. We need to do better. I'm supportive of initiatives to establish a university in Midland or Armidale, although clearly it would need to be accessible to those without money. I applaud the establishment of the university campuses in areas such as Rockingham and Mandurah, and now it's East Metro's turn. A university in these areas would both practically allow eastern suburbs residents to more readily access a tertiary education, but it also sends an important message of aspiration to the youth of these areas, who are currently well under the average in terms of accessing a tertiary education. We also need to be serious about training and about our apprenticeship regimes. This time last year we were bemoaning the lack of qualified tradespeople. I sincerely hope that the inevitable bust which followed the boom is not allowed to be the excuse to deprioritise funding for training opportunities. As I see it, an increase in the unemployment levels makes it all the more important to invest in training up our Australian workforce now. For the same reasons, I remain an ardent advocate for ensuring that apprentice wages are livable wages. There are many apprentices who are adults and who have families to support. So let's invest in training and apprenticeship options. Let's invest in our future now. Speaking of preparing for the future, I of course need to speak about the biggest crisis facing our future. Clearly, I'm talking about climate change. I'm not going to use this speech to present the case for climate change, because it's here, and it's real, and it's the scientific consensus. I was one of the people talking about this 20 years ago when it was known as global warming, and it was real then too. Although it's a great shame that successive governments didn't use those 20 years to begin the transition to a low-carbon future, we know now that public sentiment is well and truly calling for urgent action to be taken, and taken now. There is a clear mandate and an expectation that we will work on the solutions. What a great opportunity, because the solutions to climate change are actually really exciting. The transition to sustainable cities and towns gives us the opportunity to move into a cleaner, post-peak oil future that creates real jobs and ultimately more affordable and more livable transport, housing and communities. Now's the time to invest in renewable energy, not as a side option, but to make the move to renewable-powered baseload. We can most certainly do it, and I would suggest any naysayers make a point of sitting down with the renewable industries and getting informed. Let's work with those innovative companies who are screaming out for investment and infrastructure support of the kind far too often extended to our outdated coal and petroleum industries. Let's make the orderly transition to renewable now, create the jobs now, retrain those workers dependent on coal and polluting industries now. Any delay only carries with it a human and environmental cost which is unforgivable. We can do better, and we should do better. Coal has no future. And to be clear, there's no room for nuclear power anywhere within a post-carbon future either. Apart from being a dangerous industry with the mind-boggling legacy of nuclear waste that is with us for thousands of years and countless generations, it is, frankly, a complete crock to suggest that it is a carbon-free technology. The Roxby Downs uranium mine will take 1 million litres of diesel a day just to create the open cut to get into the ore body. Once you calculate the nuclear cycle from mining through to decommissioning of a nuclear power plant, any suggestion that it is carbon low or even carbon neutral technology becomes exposed as the farce it is. It's not a solution to climate change or our energy needs, and we need to get past it. Although I understand that the nuclear industry is an experienced advocate for itself, loose with the truth and seductive in its promises of easy, albeit very short term, money, this is not an industry we want to sleep with. Sustainable cities mean the exciting prospect of sustainable housing, housing which makes full use of both passive and active solar design, which uses a variety of renewable energy options. You can even get discrete wind turbines on domestic housing these days, houses which conserve water and catch the little water we have. And we need a gross feed-in tariff. Those individuals who take it upon themselves to invest in renewable energy within their own homes to relieve the state of the need to invest in broader power infrastructure should be rewarded and encouraged. We want this on every roof. And the truly exciting thing about housing which is being sustainably designed is that it is ultimately cheaper to live in. As our electricity prices inevitably begin to soar, the importance of this on our most disadvantaged becomes all the more urgent. Sustainable cities also means real investment in our public transport options. When it comes to public transport, I'm a strong believer in the adage that if you create it, they will come. We saw this with the Mandurah line, we've seen it with our CAT buses in the city. If we were to invest in light rail options, buses of all sizes which were appropriate for the area and usage, bicycle paths just to name a few, then the experience from cities around the world is that people will use them. The key to a successful public transport system is frequency and reliability. The last thing we should be doing at this point is anything which would suggest pulling back on the meagre services which already exist. Such moves would hit East Metro particularly hard. East Metro has the largest number of people in the metro area who would be the most adversely affected by increasing oil prices. Helping people out of their car dependency by providing viable alternatives is one of the keys to addressing climate change. And on a side note, I look forward to the day when the railway stations on the eastern lines start to look as flash as those on the other lines. As well as reducing our carbon emissions, let's also look to preserve those carbon sinks which still remain. In East Metro in particular, this would be our precious darling scarp. As I mentioned at the beginning, I love the hills, so do the residents that live there and the multiple flatlanders who want to recreate there. But our hills are currently subject to planning regimes which were created at a time when their value as bushland, water catchments and simply the rich biodiversity of the area clearly was not fully appreciated. The hills are not ecologically designed to carry dense developments. The irony of current plans to create dense development enclaves in the hills is that the Perth inner suburbs are simultaneously being denied essential infrastructure on the basis that the density there is simply too low. It's a lose-lose situation. Let's stop planning the dense developments in the middle of nowhere without considering access to services and the protection of precious ecosystems. Perth is drying and we need to preserve what water catchments remain. And we need to become sensible about our water usage, both how we use it but also how we reuse it. Adding more and more desalination plants is not the answer, certainly not for as long as they are driven by baseload energy powered by coal. The short-term solution? Cut down on the enormous water wastage currently occurring and provide incentives for all water users to embrace world's best practice water efficiency. And then if we need to look at desalination options, let's look at some of the emerging technologies. But back to the hills. We need to remember that much of the hills contain Indigenous sacred sites, and that when we develop and quarry and pollute, we are desecrating Indigenous history and desecrating their religious sites as surely as if our own churches were being destroyed. The suffering which our Indigenous people have experienced and continue to experience is a source of great shame. We all know the shameful statistics around life expectancy, health and education, imprisonment and, of course, deaths in custody. The injustices simply have to stop. As we know, the injustices confronting our Indigenous peoples is a statewide issue, with serious issues particularly in the regions. But even in East Metro, we have our own history of injustice against the Swan Valley Noongar community. This community has been robbed of their lands, had their families separated and made homeless. They deserve a better deal. They deserve justice. Sorry was a start, but so far away from where we need to end up to truly become an inclusive and reconciled community. East Metro is a diverse community and is the most heavily populated of all the 6 upper house regions. I love this diversity. I love that there is so much difference to celebrate. East Metro has large numbers of migrant communities from many religions and backgrounds from all over the world. I welcome those migrants who have chosen to make Perth home, as I also welcome those refugees who have made their way here escaping terror and persecution, even if by means that, whilst legal under international law, are unfairly labelled as illegal here. I remain a strong ally to the many gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex and queer identifying members of our community. I've long campaigned to uphold the human rights of the LGBTI community, and my commitment to this now that I'm in Parliament is stronger than ever. Homophobia is abhorrent to me, and utterly contrary to the Christian values of love, compassion, acceptance with which I was raised. I'm a huge supporter of families. Nuclear families, blended families, extended families, families with two mums, families with two dads, families run by grandparents or aunts and uncles, foster families, sole parent families. There is no one family form that is more important than another. Families come in all different ways, sometimes by choice, sometimes not, but all are worthy of our respect. But in particular, I will pay tribute to those parents who are doing it alone. Today, I'm a married mother of 3, but this wasn't always the way. 13 years ago, I was a sole parent, and I was even on a pension. As far as I was concerned, my daughter was the greatest thing that had ever happened to me, so it was baffling and insulting that some within our community sought to treat me and my little family as though we were substandard or inferior as a family. It was a ridiculous and offensive prejudice, but very real. In contrast to those people, I salute those parents who undertake the hardest job in the world all by themselves. And for as long as I'm in Parliament, you'll have an advocate who will support you and recognise the valuable contribution you're making. I'm pleased to note that a bill to incorporate breastfeeding into the Equal Opportunity Act has been introduced into the Assembly. I look forward to getting the opportunity to debate this long overdue amendment in the Council. It's extraordinary that in this day and age, women are still being discriminated against for feeding their children, and I wonder at the perversity of the mind who equates breastfeeding with a sexual act. I would have introduced the bill myself, but the long lag between being elected and taking up my seat meant that I was beaten to the punch. And on that note, I also look forward to debating the legislation for the long overdue introduction of fixed-term elections. The Equal Opportunity Act and the protections it affords is an absolute necessity. Although I understand that some in this Council would question the need for such an act, unfortunately I can assure you that the sorts of protections this Act affords are all too necessary. I certainly hope that one day this Act does become redundant, and I'm eagerly awaiting the day that discrimination is a thing of the past. I've already mentioned that I used to work for a union. Actually, I used to work for a number of unions, both white and blue collar, and was in the union movement right up until I started my term here. In my time, I've been an organiser, an industrial officer, and recently a union lawyer. You might think it's strange that a Greens member has such a long union background. Don't be. There are many people who are in the Greens and who vote Green who are very involved in the union movement. The Greens are wholly supportive of collective action and support the right of workers to collectively bargain through their unions for a better deal. And quite often, the better deal that unions want for their members also translate to a better deal for the community. As a case in point, the current campaign by the ASU for a better deal for workers in community services, if successful, and I certainly hope it will be, will not only ensure a better deal for these amazing workers holding together our community services sector, but will translate to better services for the clients, who are often our most marginalised, which means a better deal for the community as a whole. Win-win. It's the unions who have been responsible for leading the charge on workplace safety. If there's one thing every worker has the fundamental right to expect, it's that they'll return home alive and intact at the end of the day. Unions should have the right to ensure work sites are safe, and there needs to be stronger and more serious penalties for those employers who are blasé, indifferent, or even downright negligent about the safety of their employees. Although in many ways working for the unions can be a thankless task, I always felt that when I went home every day that I'd been a part of something important, upholding the human rights of workers, helping those in crisis, defending workers from unfair, discriminatory practices felt like worthwhile work to me. Over the years, I've accumulated so many horror stories as to the treatment of individual workers. In particular, I'm struck by the sheer level of discrimination experienced by so many working mothers and pregnant women. Hard to believe, but we actually really haven't come that far. Unfortunately, my father, who I've already mentioned, isn't here tonight. He died many years ago. The circumstances of his death have had a permanent effect on me, and after years of personal reconciliation, I bring this personal experience to my public life. I'm talking about the debilitating effects of mental illness and the devastating effects of suicide. The most recent research on rates of mental illness indicate that mental illness will strike not just 1 in 5 Australians as previously suggested, which in itself is an incredibly high number of people, but 1 in 5 Australians within any 12-month period. This is an enormous number of people who are suffering at any given time, and reason enough to be prioritising issues of the prevention of mental illness, as well as ensuring appropriate and urgent attention for those who find themselves in its grip. But more than the sheer numbers involved, it is the seriousness of the potential effects of mental illness, which mean that we should be paying far closer attention to addressing it. For those suffering from mental illness, and I'm acutely aware that we could be talking anything here, from various levels of depression to the most serious forms of mental illness, it is to be stuck in a life half-lived. Please remember, whether due to life circumstance, chemistry, injury or something else, mental illness has the potential to strike anyone at any point in their life. I'm heartened at the prospect that the important issue of suicide prevention may be starting to get the attention it deserves. It isn't just about saving those lives, it's about saving the lives of those who are left behind. Be under no delusion. Suicide destroys families, and children don't bounce back, they just delay the effects of the trauma. In my early 20s, I became a trained play leader and worked with children, many of whom came from stable homes, but also many who were in crisis or who had been referred by the equivalent of child protection. I understand the critical importance of the need to fund early intervention for those children and families who've experienced trauma. Money spent on early intervention is money saved in the long term. Many of those we see today who are self-medicating with drugs or alcohol are exactly those people who should have been given help in the first place. For these people, jail's not the solution, but programs to assist with the underlying causes of the distress and trauma are. To treat all those with substance abuse problems as though they are criminals is to abdicate our humanity. It's true I'm a person who cares about a great many things. Count yourselves lucky. If I wanted to be super indulgent, I'd regale you with my views on the travesty of mandatory sentencing, homelessness, the amazing work of our community legal sector and why it deserves to get better funding, protection of our southwest forests, aged care, pay equity, the borough, our rivers, government accountability and transparency. The list goes on, and hopefully I will get the opportunity to regale you all with my views sometime in the next 4 years. No apologies, I'm not a single issue person any more than the Greens have ever been a single issue party. So for the last 5 minutes, I'll focus instead on that all-important part where I get to thank a whole lot of people that most of you don't know, but that I do. People who've believed in me personally and believed in what the Greens are trying to do. And I should warn my lovely friends, and you know who you are, you may not get a mention, sorry. My first thanks will go to my parents, my father, who instilled in me, in the 2 short time I had him in my life, love, compassion and genuine acceptance of others, and that the need to do good works is the purpose for which we exist. And I thank my mother, my strong, intelligent mother, for being there, even though she's not here tonight, and for teaching me that a woman's place is wherever she feels she can make the most positive difference. Sometimes that's been with my babies, but right now it's in this parliament. I also wish to pay tribute to former Senator Jo Valentine, who first inspired me to become politically active over 2 decades ago when I was just a teenager. It's to her and her good works that I was inspired to join the Greens in the first place almost 20 years ago. I'm humbled to now call her my friend and mentor, and I thank you for being the brave and inspiring woman you are. But ultimately I'm here because of an election. Obviously I thank all those grassroots Greens members who supported me in pre-selection, as I thank those who encouraged me to put my hand up in the first place. I thank wholeheartedly those many people who got involved in the East Metro campaign. If you're at those meetings, you know there were too many people involved to mention today. And obviously throughout the duration of the campaign, there were hundreds of people who leafleted, campaigned and handed out how to votes in East Metro alone. So I will specifically thank those brave souls who put their hand up to be candidates for the East Metro campaign. Thanks go to Chris Dickinson, Sian Harper, Sally Palmer, Michael Boswell, Jenny Bowman, Tony Warden, Denise Hardy, Owen Davies, Karen Willinger, Luke Edmonds, Jenny Carter, Kaz Bowman, Louise Judge, Glenn George, Damien Douglas Meyer and finally Steve Wolfe, the latter of whom could take over from me should I be hit by the proverbial bus any time in the next 4 years. For going over and above in hours of unpaid work, thanks and love must go to Sandra Wright, Taya Brennan, Kate Davies, Margot Bealby, Dominic Lieb, Gemma Carter and Georgia Johnson. To my mother-in-law Sue Edmonds, I say thank you for hours of babysitting at terribly short notice. For those who I've not mentioned, particularly those who ran the Central campaign, I apologise. But this was a campaign of so many, I'm sure you'll understand I simply can't mention everyone. Finally, there is my little family to whom I owe the greatest debt of all. To my 3 children, Miette, Jackson and Blake. I thank you for your understanding that Mummy is going to yet another meeting. I thank you for being so well behaved in the meetings I brought you along to. And I hope that one day you'll understand, as I know Miette you're starting to, that I'm trying to create a better world and a better future for you. My greatest thanks, of course, is to my amazing husband, Luke Edmonds. I think in a world which often doesn't value women's public contribution and which too frequently ridicules or demeans men who take on the primary role as carer for their children, that it takes a man of strong character to take that role on willingly. You are that man. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for supporting me, and thank you for loving me. Thank you for your sharp intellect, for the vigorous debates, and for your commitment to the Greens' vision, which is as strong as mine. I just wouldn't want to do this if you weren't there. I look forward to working with the rest of my Green parliamentary team, Senators Scott Ludlam and Rachel Seward, and of course my colleagues Lynn McLaren, Robin Chappell, Adele Carles, and in particular our elder stateswoman Giz Watson, who I thank for her ongoing support and guidance. I also look forward to working with the rest of you in this council. I hope that we can do good things for this state and its people, and I hope that myself and the rest of my East Metro councillors can achieve good things for our wonderful region. Thanks to all of you in the gallery for coming out on this cold and dark night. Really, this is just the beginning. Thanks.